Hi, thanks for joining me here for this lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be discussing overcoming groupthink in idea generation. So what exactly is groupthink? I want you to imagine a situation where you have a workplace and you have a group that is pretty cohesive. They're kind of the in group. They tend to make most of the decisions. And you have a person who's, maybe on the outside a little bit on the fringes. They work with this group, but they're not really a part of them, so to speak. And one day the group is trying to solve a problem and they raise a question, and the person on the fringes comes up with an idea that's a little bit outside of what would be normal for the group. And they say, hey, what if we try something different here to solve this problem? And the response that they get from the main group is essentially, shut up, we don't do things differently. That's not how we do it. That's outside of the norm of what we do. Well, what's going to happen there moving forward is that when that group tries to solve problems, this person over here on the right is going to be very, very resistant to put out new ideas. If they do put out an idea, it's going to be something that it conforms more to what this group would typically do. Okay, and that right there is an example of what we would call groupthink, which is a situation where people tend to hold back their feelings or change their feelings and beliefs based upon what the group around them desires. Okay, so what are some of the causes of groupthink? For starters, we have pressure from the group, and that's what we talked about in that opening example there. So in the opening example, the person who was on the fringes put something out there and they were immediately shut down and verbally assaulted by the in-group. That would be an example of pressure that would cause groupthink. All right, then we have a desire to fit in with the group. Okay, if our ideas are very different from what other people have out there, it's very difficult for us to see ourselves as identifying with them and being a part of their group. So we try to find ways to change our opinions and change our ideas so that we can conform to the group that we want to identify with. All right. Then we have a need for agreement. Simply put, it's more desirable to agree with people than to argue with them. It feels better to agree with people than to argue with them. And then finally, a group can have a focus on performance as opposed to a focus on learning. And what I mean by that is when we have a focus on performance, we're looking for ideas that we can enact quickly so that we can go out, perform, and get the job done. Whereas when we have a focus on learning, we're looking to dive deeply into ideas and identify what is the best one and develop new insights and new practices moving forward. So when there's a focus on performance, those outside ideas that may be very different aren't quite as valuable because they're going to take more time before we can enact them. When there's a focus on learning, the amount of time that we have to take to explore all these outside ideas is a little bit more valued because our goals are different than when our focus is on performance. So when there's a focus on performance, we tend to shut down outside ideas and ideas that differ from our norm because we're not positioned to enact on them quickly. All right. So if all this talk about groupthink has you pretty much ready to have your head explode, let's think about how can we minimize groupthink. The first thing we can do in our organizations is we can have small groups. Generally speaking, if we have groups of 10 or smaller, it's a lot easier to minimize groupthink. And the reason for that is we don't get kind of this network effect where people build up and just conform, but we can actually sit down and have real discussions. And if somebody has an idea that is a little bit outside of what the norm is, if there's not that many people, it's easier to kind of talk through that idea as opposed to having 20, 25 people say, no, 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 that's not what we do. Okay. Then the second thing is we can have impartial leaders. Okay. If our leader's not impartial, then what's going to happen is once we get into a discussion, the leader puts their opinion on the table, everybody is going to flock to that because we all want to look good in the eyes of the leader. We all want to be accepted by the leader and we want to identify with the leader. So we need the leader to facilitate the discussion, but be very careful not to let their ideas and their opinions be known, because as soon as the leader lets our ideas and opinions be known, the rest of the group is going to conform to that. We're going to have groupthink. And I'm going to give you an example there. Back when I was in the industry, I was a pricing manager, and we would have monthly meetings where we talk about what our strategy for pricing was going to be that month. And one of the people who sat in on those meetings was our vice president. And what I noticed over time was that in some months, our vice president was a little more vocal about what he thought we should do than in other months. And in the months where he was vocal, everybody else who was in that room just pretty much echoed his thoughts, supported the ideas he had, and moved forward. Whereas in the months where he wasn't quite so vocal, what we tend to have greater dissent in our discussions and come up with different types of ideas. We didn't have quite as much conformity in our thought, and we would explore ideas deeper. And that's because we didn't really know what it was that our VP was looking for at that moment. So we were exploring ideas. Whereas in the months that he was vocal, We all kind of felt like it was in our best interest to just support his ideas and not be in conflict with him. So how is groupthink different from group shift? Now, if you look at the diagrams we have over here on the left, we have groupthink. This is an area where we have one in-group and everybody's kind of trying to be a part of that in-group. Whereas over on the right here, this is an example of group shift where we have two different groups and people kind of pick a side and the two different groups are in conflict to a certain degree. Okay, so how does group shift occur? Group shift starts with, as you would imagine, two different groups. Okay, now as you look at these groups, you'll see they are pretty different. Okay, so we have group one over here, and then we have group two over here. And for the most part, they appear to be on kind of different sides of an issue, but they do have a little bit of an area here where they overlap. There is some agreement between the two groups. But now what happens over time, though, is as these groups debate and as they argue, they actually grow further apart. So over time, what we see with these groups is that there ends up being no common ground. This area where both groups were before is virtually empty. Group two is much further off to the right, and group one is much further off to the left. Okay, now why does this happen? Okay, there are several reasons that we can see group shift occur. And the first is people become comfortable within their group. Okay, so if I'm a member of group one and I put an idea out there and it's echoed by other people in group one, I become kind of comfortable there and I keep putting things out and we're building off of each other and we're actually having almost a little bit of group think within our own group, but we become comfortable with each other and the more comfortable we become, the further from center we're willing to go. Okay, then we have a desire to differentiate. Okay, and again, if I'm in group one and I want to be different from group two, I can't have an idea that's close to that overlap. I want to show that I'm different, so I go a little bit further to the left. Okay, finally, accountability shifts from a person to the group. And what I mean by that is the ideas that we put out there as they become a little more abstract, a little more outlandish, a little further out there from what we're used to, they become attributed to the group and not to the individual. So my risk of having negative repercussions for putting an idea out there is now minimized because the negative repercussions will be associated with the group, not just with myself. So I have lower risk in terms of putting ideas out there. All right. Now, let's move forward into idea generation. We'll talk about brainstorming. And what brainstorming is, most of us are probably pretty familiar with it. It's idea generation that encourages all ideas to be presented and no criticism. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't have groupthink or group shift in brainstorming. One of the drawbacks that we have in brainstorming, however, is that as we're all competing to have our ideas heard, sometimes ideas get lost. We don't hear them, people don't speak up enough. We start to see different leaders emerge in the group who are putting out more ideas, and then other people start to be quieter. The other thing that can happen with brainstorming is that we can have groupthink emerge. And when groupthink emerges, what we see is that the ideas that we generate in brainstorming all tend to be aligned with what we think that group is going to be accepting of. Alternatively, we can see some group shift occur in brainstorming, where depending on which group you're a part of there, your ideas will gear towards one side or towards the other. All right, so how do we address these issues of groupthink and group shift in brainstorming? One tool that we can use is called the nominal group technique. And what the nominal group technique does is it basically combines the best of our individual thoughts with the benefits of vetting ideas through groups. And to do this, the first step that we have is all individuals quietly create a list of ideas. The goal here is for us to find every idea that every individual has come up with in the group without their ideas being filtered by other members of the team. We don't want people to be resistant to put things out there because of pressures or desires to conform or anything like that. Once all the ideas have been generated and we have our lists on our pieces of paper, we then share our ideas one at a time. And as you'll see from the illustration here, we look to go around in a circle. So person one will share an idea, then person two will share an idea, person three, and so on until we're back to person one and they share their second idea. Okay, and the reason that we do this way is that by having people share one idea at a time, we can't identify trends as to what seems normal in the group and what's not normal in the group. We get a good diversity of ideas throughout the entire process as they come out. Okay, once we've shared all the ideas and we have a nice big list out there, then we're going to discuss them. This is the point where people will ask for clarifications. We'll talk about benefits of ideas. We'll talk about the risks of ideas, and we'll kind of debate their merit. Finally, we privately, quietly, and anonymously rank the ideas. The reason we do this privately, quietly, and anonymously is because we don't want there to be any pressures for people to behave in one way or another. By making this anonymous, nobody ever knows how you ranked your ideas, so you don't have any pressures that are pushing you in one direction or another. Once we're done with this, we tally all the scores from the rankings and we decide which way we want to go from there based upon the tallies and the calculations. Okay? And by doing this, what we do is we take the best aspects of our individuals and the best aspects of our groups and we combine them while minimizing the potential for groupthink and group shift.